Hello, and thank you very much for coming along once again. Today we're going to look at another part in our analysis of the Green Revolution, asking after the Green Revolution, who owns global agriculture, and particularly examining the fatal mistake of misplaced metaphors in our globalized agro-ecosystem. This is part 7 of an ongoing series, and you may want to check back in the previous series as these affect what we're going to look at today. In particular, we're going to examine the legacy of Norman Borlaug and all of the agricultural experimentation he did, extending what he found from varieties around the world in what then became known as the Green Revolution. Then we're going to look at sort of responses to it as well, including local responses in Africa. And we're going to pose the question and answer it simply in these terms. Humankind will not survive the trajectories of current agricultural production systems in Earth's finite ecosystem. It will not survive them because it cannot survive them, because ecosystems don't work in the same way that the Green Revolution has transformed the world's agriculture to work as a market-based system. That's the fatal mistake of the misplaced metaphor. The ecosystem is not a marketplace. So we'll look at the summary situations of the last several sessions. Part 1 dealt with the tragic story of the modern world's love affair with the Green Revolution. Part 2 looked at the rise and forthcoming demise of petro-intensive agriculture, emphasizing some of the scientific critique from people like Vandana Shiva. In fact, Vandana Shiva then spoke at length about the mythology of the Green Revolution in Part 3. In Part 4, we asked the question of, was there any realistic alternative to the Green Revolution technology? And looked at several responses saying, yes, in fact, there was a realistic alternative. And then in Part 5, we looked at the Green Revolution and the Alliance for the Green Revolution in Africa, known as AGRA, and the African agricultural narrative that they are promoting. In Part 6, we looked at the new scramble for Africa and the resistance to corporate land grabbing and the AGRA meta-narrative about agriculture in Africa. It's worth reviewing what the press thinks, in this case, The Economist thinks about Africa and the new scramble for Africa. They see it not as something that's terribly limiting, but something that's enabling. Let's take a look.
The first scramble for Africa was when European colonial powers saw a continent that was vast, rich in minerals and land, and very poorly defended, and they rushed in to carve it up and steal the land. The second was during the Cold War, when East and West were locked in a struggle for global domination. That's when the Soviet Union backed Marxist despots all over Africa, and the Americans backed any leader who said that he was in favor of capitalism. The third wave, which is happening right now, is much more benign. It's much more about voluntary exchange, about trade, and about the spread of technology. It's a new kind of scramble for Africa, which, if handled well, Africans can win. The old stereotype of foreigners in Africa is that they're only interested in the minerals and not Africa's people. That's still sometimes true, and there are still a lot of corrupt mineral deals going on in Africa. But much more important now is African people. There'll be more Africans in the world than Chinese people by 2025. It's a huge market, and since they're all living in independent countries, they're in a much better position than in the past to negotiate better deals with the outside world. And this has been great for Africans. Greater openness to trade and investment from the outside world is one of the reasons why Africans are 2/5 richer than they were in 2000. Of course, the fact that there are fewer wars and better macroeconomic policies has also helped. There's still a big problem with corruption. Unaccountable leaders in the less transparent African countries can often sign deals with outsiders that benefit them personally, but perhaps not their countries so much. The things that Russia's doing in the Central African Republic, where you have private firms protecting diamond mines and the president of that war-torn country, are to many people reminiscent of what happened in the 19th century at the height of imperialism. The scale of foreign interest is unprecedented. Between 2010 and 2016, 320 new embassies were opened in Africa, probably the largest embassy building boom anywhere, ever. Turkey alone opened 26. Last year, India announced it was going to open 18. Military links are spreading too. China alone has ties with 45 African countries. America and France are helping defeat terrorists in the Sahel. Oil-rich Arab nations are setting up military bases in the Gulf. And Russia has military deals with 19 African countries. African voters and watchdogs need to insist on more transparency in the way that these deals are done. The kind of work that Kenyan journalists have done to expose scandals connected to a Chinese railway project is very encouraging. Second, African leaders need to think more strategically. China is one country, Africa's 54. It's going to be much harder for them to drive the right kind of bargains if they let China negotiate with them individually behind closed doors. Even if African unity is a bit of a far-off dream at the moment, at least you could see more regional unity, which would be very useful in negotiating infrastructure projects. Finally, Africans should take what some of their new friends tell them with a pinch of salt. The Chinese government is very keen to tell Africans that democracy is a Western idea and that development needs a firm hand. This may be music to the ears of some of the strongmen on the continent, but African voters should not be fooled by it. There's a lot of research out there suggesting that the African countries that are more democratic tend to grow faster and prosper better. As the population gets more educated and moves into the cities more, we're seeing that they're more critical of governments and giving the ruling party a lower share of the vote. As African politics grows more competitive, voters will have more clout, and they'll be able to insist on a form of globalization that works for Africans and foreigners alike.
Well, the new empowering experience about the scramble described by journalists at places like The Economist is portrayed as if it gives Africa a great deal of new power in this new scramble. But this newfound negotiative power that's referred to by the journalists is not really experienced by many Africans when it comes to things like the land grab that's occurring globally now to assure food security in other parts of the world. Let's take a look again and remind ourselves how Africa is situated in reference to this global shift in food production and the scramble for land everywhere on the African continent as well as elsewhere. The new scramble for Africa, as it was referred to, is in effect met with this local resistance to corporate land grabbing and the Alliance for the Green Revolution in Africa meta-narrative about primitive agricultural technology and understandings.
Dividing up the world's breadbasket. Rich countries are racing to buy and lease agricultural land abroad and secure their food supplies for the future. Critics are calling it a colonial land grab.
The scale is something we've never seen before. I mean, there are huge pieces of land, 6 million acres in the Congo, bought by China to grow palm oil.
It's reported 40 million hectares of land has been bought or leased in $100 billion worth of deals. Now the UN's Food and Agriculture Organization is proposing a code of conduct to guide the global land grab.
Governments need to be much more assertive. At the moment they're signing away huge pieces of their territory for very little money and very few guarantees. The deals are secret So if we had some more transparency, if you could see what the deals were, local people could do something about it and get a better deal.
Not only are wealthy companies directly buying and leasing land around the world, they've also started to form local partnerships with companies. And this is so they can get a direct stake in their agricultural industry. Now, one of the companies that's leading the way is actually right here in Qatar. Hassad Food is aiming to not only guarantee Qatar's food security, but become a global food supplier.
We are targeting crops and type of food. So, for instance, if we are talking about sugar, then it has to be in Latin America, precisely in Brazil, or it could be in India. If we are targeting wheat, then it has to be somewhere in Australia, or in Latin America, or in even Eastern Europe.
He says he doesn't know why some people are alarmed about their business.
I have no idea at all. But maybe the stereotype of the wealthy countries grabbing the feed from the poor countries.
From Sudan to Romania, anywhere that can grow food is now prime real estate, after governments were rocked by food riots last year. One of the most aggressive buys has been Saudi Arabia. It's setting up a chain of 1,000 square kilometre farms abroad and plans to ship the food directly to the kingdom. And it seems food prices are about to go back up.
The food prices bottomed out in about March, and now they're going up. They're already to where they were in 2007. If you look at the graph, it's quite scary.
A global grab for land. The question is, will there be enough of it to go around? Nicole Johnston, Al Jazeera, Doha.
Devlin Kuyik is at the World Food Security Summit in Rome. He works for GRAIN, an international non-profit organization that supports small farmers. He says the problem of land grabbing has spiraled out of control.
Some farmers' organizations I've talked to have said, hey, if you're going to come in and negotiate a price and you want to purchase food from us, well, we're prepared to sit down at the table with you. But if you want to come in here and buy our farmland, control our farmland, and decide where that food is going to be going, there's no way. There's no way we're going to allow for that to happen. So of course, you know, that's a better scenario what you've mentioned. But the reality is that the private investors these days are interested in taking control of the food system. We've identified about $100 billion now being mobilized to buy up farmland, okay, to invest in taking over farms. It's a major new trend. Everything we've heard here says that nobody is dealing with the importance of this issue, the significance of this issue. We're talking about vague codes of conduct that have no teeth. Nobody's addressing the fundamental problem, so it's no surprise that you're seeing countries taking these extreme measures and outsourcing their food production. Really, we have to start looking at how can we get support to farmers? How can small-scale farmers who make up 80% of those who are the hungry in the world today, 80% of that 1 billion who are in the hungry today are small farmers, how can we get support to them to help them produce food? Not only for their families and for the local communities, but there could be ways of producing more food globally. And that's a long-term scenario. I mean, this is long-term thinking.
There are other social and ecological ramifications of the Green Revolution that need to be examined as well, including, in effect, the globalization of GMOs and biofuels, leading to what Vandana Shiva has labeled as the new food wars. In part, these are wars over food, but in part, they're wars over what other uses can be made of agricultural production than just food. In effect, biofuels are now being seen as an alternative in the Western world to the use of petroleum. That sets up a tension, because if the biofuels are generated from things like maize, they directly compete with the food supply of many parts of the world that have come to depend on maize. Very, very important. How biofuels could starve the poor was an article written in Foreign Affairs by Ford Runge and Benjamin Senauer. This is quite ominous because it means that there is a pitting of the future of Western mobility with its cars, trucks, and tractors run on ethanol versus the survival of many populations in the world that have come to depend on maize. mandating hunger, the impacts of global biofuel mandates and targets. This is something, a publication put out by ActionAid, emphasizing the fact that large parts of the third world could be pushed into dependence on other kinds of crops than ones they've come to depend on, with maize and maize surpluses available on the international grain markets. Those surpluses disappear and they don't have the capacity in their own ecosystems to shift to other forms of production. They could be without a food supply very quickly. In fact, it's become such an anxiety by the rapporteur for the global food crisis at the UN, a gentleman named Jean Ziegler, that he started to refer to it as a crime against humanity in the operation of markets that favor biofuels and the consumption of maize in the creation of biofuels over the provision of food supplies to those who need it.
My name is Jean Ziegler. I'm a United Nations rapporteur on the right to food and author of the book The Empire of Shame. A horrible catastrophe is unfolding today on the planet due to the explosion of staple food prices, world market prices in the world. Bioethanol is one of the reasons why the food prices explode. Last year, the United States of America burned 138 million tons of maize to transform it into bioethanol and biodiesel. Burning food today as to serve the mobility of the rich countries, this is a crime against humanity. All the money which can be mobilized by the rich countries of the north should go to assure food sovereignty, to irrigation, to fertilizers, roads, markets, so that the poorest country of the world, they can feed themselves. President Solnik from the World Bank thinks that almost 1/3 of the price rise, of the price explosion, is due to speculative gains. So this speculation on foodstuff has to stop. New stock exchange norms have to be decided as to paralyze the arm of the speculators. These reforms, which are urgent, depend on the will of the democratic countries, which means of their public opinion. And if they don't happen, for years to come, there will be hunger, insurrection, instability, and above all, dying of hundreds and hundreds of millions of people.
Still further problems exist in terms of the financing of some of these large projects, what are being called food and misinvestments in agriculture, the land grabbing in third world areas. This is something that's been highlighted by Anuradha Mittal at the Oakland Institute, and it's worth following in great detail.
The other kind of speculation that I wanted to talk about is in land. The same thing has happened with the collapse of the housing market, with the rise in the food prices, with the financial crisis. Two things have happened. There are food insecure countries, such as the Gulf states, South Korea, Japan. They depend nearly on 60% of the food needs are met through food imports. So when the food prices went up, they realized that they need to ensure their food security. So they have been going into very rich areas but poor countries buying up land. Say in Africa, Ethiopia, Sudan, Tanzania. You had countries like India who saw an opportunity to make money, that there's need for food, so they are going into, they're financing the corporations to go into countries like Ethiopia, buy up millions of hectares, actually lease millions of hectares of land to grow cereals for export. And then, of course, you have the private investors from Goldman Sachs to JP Morgan to others who are looking for opportunities to make money, and they realize agriculture is the other sector. So they have been leasing or contracting land or buying land in poor countries, predominantly in Africa, a trend which has come to be known as land grabs. Initially, there was a strong reaction from Food and Agriculture Organization, from IFAD, from the World Bank, expressing concern about its implications on food security for the poor and hungry in third world countries. And immediately, the development discourse took over, which is, this is a great win-win situation, because investors can make money, the food insecure countries can have access to food, and these poor countries who are cash-strapped can make some money. I mean, while they're at it, they might as well sell their mothers and sisters, right? Anyway, financial crisis was used by the World Bank. World Bank has gone in and told poor countries that you are in a financially strapped economy. You need to make yourself more open to investment reforms that will make you more attractive to foreign direct investment. So International Finance Corporation and MIGA, which is Multilateral Investment Guarantee Agency, which are private sector arms of the World Bank, they have gone and advised and helped set up investment firms in Ethiopia Business Forum, in Sierra Leone, and they are facilitating this takeover of lands. Why would you complain? Well, between 2006 and 2009, nearly 50 million hectares of land has been leased or purchased, again, in poor countries. Some of these deals, which are 99-year lease for 99 cents per acre per year, are unbelievable deals. They are available to a very select few. They're not available to the local small farmers who are struggling for a piece of land. They're struggling for access to resources such as water. They are happening in countries such as Ethiopia, where 13 million people depend on food aid. So try imagine trucks of food aid, full of USAID food aid, coming into Ethiopia, while there are trucks full of grains leaving Ethiopia while people starve. We put out a report called Misinvestment in Agriculture, which you can download from our website. It has a great foreword by Howard Buffett, who is son of Warren Buffett. I'm sure many of you are aware of who that is. He points out that I am the demographic that the countries are hoping to attract. Just a few months ago, Howard was offered an equity stake in a land deal that was being brokered by a hedge fund. He was told that the partners would receive cash upfront with no personal liability, that the host government will provide 70% of the financing. The host government will pay for all utilities. The 98-year lease required no payments for 4 years. The cost was $2.91 per acre per year after 4 years. Another fund provided a prospectus that promised returns of between 15 and 20%. Just recently, I've been looking at the prospectus of funds which are based in Europe and Singapore, US. They promise returns of 25, 30%. The US agricultural land has averaged a return of about 6% over the past 30 years. So compare in the US, it's 6% returns vis-a-vis 25, 30% returns that are being promised in Africa. So either these deals are really good for investors, or the managers of these funds are hoodwinking and lying to people. But as Howard says, if we didn't know better, it would sound like a great opportunity. I know many of you are thinking of running out to look for those hedge funds. But he says, here is what I'm sure of. These deals will make the rich richer and the poor poorer, creating clear winners who benefit while the losers are denied their livelihoods. And as I said, many of the hedge funds, Wall Street banks are involved in it. I was recently at an ag investors conference in Geneva, and it is just mind-blowing. You know, somebody talks about water, that, water is the next blue gold, and somebody raises the hand and say, how do I make money on it? I mean, literally, it's true. Somebody was like, can you tell me, how do I make profits? How do I make money off water? You talk about starvation, and they say, wow, food is a hot commodity. That's where I need to go invest in. Just to give you an example of Ethiopia, again, as I said, a massive lease project is on. Ethiopia Business Forum, which was created by the International Finance Corporation, is facilitating these deals. To give you the example, Karthuri Overseas Limited, which is a subsidiary of the world's largest rose exporter, Karthuri Global, out of India, it has bought close to 1 million hectares of land in areas such as Gambela, where the Anuak tribal community has been marginalized, which has seen massacres in a country where just before elections in May, 30,000 people were arrested just because they had a political opinion and were opposing. Edible oil manufacturer Ruchi Soya also has entered into a contract with the Ethiopian government. They have leases for 25 years. The next African country will come by and say, we give you a lease for 99 years. So it's a race to the bottom. People who say it's a win-win situation, if you look at the budget, 2010 budget of Ethiopia, this income is not reflected. It's not coming to the people of Ethiopia. So you have to question, where does this money go? And before I run out of time, I'll just say, it is true. You know, after the food crisis, people started saying, we need to invest in agriculture. It is interesting, World Bank and all are talking about investment in agriculture without saying that it is the policies of institutions such as the World Bank and IMF that are responsible in the first place for African countries not investing in agriculture. Structural adjustment programs were responsible for shrinking the government to a size, as they say in US, you can drown it in a bathtub. Small government. Don't interfere with agriculture. Let the market prevail. And then we talk about investment. So what kind of investment do we see? We see land investment without really looking at what kind of investment we do. So yes, it's true, Africa needs investment in agriculture. It needs investment in supporting small-scale farmers, as a UNDP or World Bank supported reports say it is about small-scale organic agriculture that can actually feed Africa. You have a continent where 90% of the population owns 1 to 5 acres of land. You don't put them on a treadmill of high input, expensive technology, which is controlled by IPRs, intellectual property rights, or you would have hunger and farmers in debt. It requires improved extension services. It requires education on conservation techniques. It requires investment for regional integration and to build local capacity. It definitely does not need policies which allow foreign investors to go back in and to grow and export food for their own people. Just at the conference that I was at in Geneva, there was a gentleman, I'm not going to go into the details, but from Lisbon, who said, you know, we Portuguese, we went and found India, we went and found America, we went and found Sierra Leone, and we gave them so much. And now we're going back to these countries and giving them again. I mean, the audacity of the colonizers to actually say that the colonized benefited from colonialism is, at least to me, I guess, because I come from a colonized country, astonishing. And lastly, World Bank, OECD, UNCTAD, they're all trying to come up with this code of conduct principles, you know, to put a sugar coating on a very bitter pill. You're taking away the sovereign right of people to have access and control over their own land. You're taking away the power of governments to be able to regulate and ensure the human right to food for all. But they come up with a code of conduct which donor countries, people sitting in Washington and Geneva have come up with no input from impacted communities or host governments. So when people say, well, what if we make it all win-win situation? I would say there's some very simple questions to ask. When local people lack land rights, they still demand land reform. Why should foreign interests and foreign businesses have precedence? What guarantees are in place to mitigate food insecurity risks for local population? What evidence is there to suggest that the land deals which will take place will be transparent when most of the land deals that have happened so far are shrouded in secrecy? At the Institute, we're doing documentation work in several African countries. You cannot find, it's impossible to see contracts. And when you find contracts, they're barely 3 paragraphs long. Why should we believe that the communities will be fully incorporated into the negotiation process when it might be in the interest of the investor or the government to exclude potential dissenters? How will best practices be replicated when there are almost no role models to follow? This whole land grabbing is not a new trend in some way. United States has had plantations in Latin America. It didn't create prosperous economies. It created banana republics. What type of enforcement will be established to ensure minimal environmental damage? What kind of quantifiable social benefits will the local communities derive? And what kind of consequences will investors and facilitating governments face if these benefits do not come to fruition? So these questions need to be answered before we go ahead with this whole land lease project for Africa. And we have to look at the history of mineral extraction. The history of mineral extraction, diamonds, gold, is a very sad, inhumane, cruel one in Africa. And when it comes to soil and water, which is the essence of life, it is even more precious. So the stakes are very high. And again, I urge you to get hold of our publications, because Howard puts it brilliantly in his foreword as he concludes and says, Africa is not a commodity. It must not be labeled open for business.
Well, this suggests that chapters in African agricultural history raise some very new but old problems. You can see it in the old African maps that in effect took shape during the slave trade period prior to colonial rule and carved up portions of Africa which were seen for their economic promise. Then there was the scramble for African territory and colonial control. But what's now emerging is a kind of corporate scramble for Africa. Is this a scramble for much needed new investment, or a kind of neo-colonial land grab that's in effect victimizing African populations with a new chapter of it, neo-colonial you could call it, but it's sort of corporate colonialism on a massive scale. It circumstance the nation state to the extent that they really have no longer any control over their own food supply, which is being generated, owned, and operated by foreign multinational corporations. This has been criticized and pointed out as an inevitable impact of the politics of ownership, and in effect, the fact that none of the agricultural development schemes can, in fact, in the long run, survive in Africa because they're based on an illusion about the way ecosystems work. Sir David Attenborough has been very powerful in pointing this out, most notably in the last meeting of the Royal Society in London under the presidency of the Duke of Edinburgh. Sir David Attenborough gave a very clear restatement of the Malthusian dilemma that we all face.
There have been prophets who've warned us of this impending disaster, of course. One of the first was Thomas Malthus. His most important book, an essay of the principle of population, was published over 200 years ago in 1798. In it, he argued that the human population would increase inexorably until it was halted by what he called misery and vice. Today, for some reason, that prophecy seems to be largely ignored, or at any rate disregarded. It's true that he did not foresee the so-called Green Revolution, which greatly increased the amount of food that can be produced in any given area of arable land. And there may be other advances in our food-producing skills that we ourselves still can't foresee. But such advances only delay things. The fundamental truth that Malthus proclaimed remains the truth. There cannot be more people on this earth than can be fed.
He concluded with a summation of the Malthus point of view that made it clear the current strategies of African food production will not meet, because they cannot meet, the current projected trajectories of Africa's and the world's food needs.
Many people would like to deny that this is so. They would like to believe in that oxymoron, sustainable growth. Kenneth Boulding, President Kennedy's environmental advisor 45 years ago, said something about this. Anyone who believes in indefinite growth in anything physical on a physically finite planet, he said, is either mad or an economist.
It's not that Norman Borlaug foresaw all of these things and worked against the autonomy of African producers. He had no intention of doing that. In fact, he wanted to empower them. But by seeing the impact of what has happened to population growth since the introduction of the Green Revolution technology, and as a result of it, that is, the tripling of the global human population in a record short period of time, something that never happened before in the lifespan of one person, but now is a feature of global agriculture. The human population tripled in the lifespan of one individual born in the late 1940s. Never happened before, won't happen again. But because Norman Borlaug addressed the food problem as one of food scarcity, he forgot the larger context that food is generated in reference to populations, and therefore food and populations are intimately linked over time. And he didn't foresee the interaction of food, population, and the environment as the context in which his policies would have to function long after he died. Those are the problems that the world now confronts. And this is why there's a paradigm shift that's required in addressing these issues, a paradigm shift which he was not prepared for, but his followers at this point are going to have to confront and absorb. Humankind cannot survive future trajectories of current agricultural systems because current practices do not solve the problem of human hunger. Instead, these practices accentuate global and national income inequity and generate the basis for expanded social strife, military conflict, and the syndromes of warfare, migration, and rural income collapse. In the process, these practices effectively expand the absolute numbers of the global poor and generate hunger faster than they can meet the needs of the growing number of the world's hungry populations. A second reason is simple. Current practices deplete topsoil, destroy biodiversity, pollute air, and poison declining water supplies. All of these things are going to be needed in abundant and increasing, not decreasing, supply to provide for stable or growing agricultural production over the long term across the whole world. Thirdly, humankind cannot survive future trajectories of current agricultural systems because current practices are predicated upon an increased, not diminished, consumption of fossil fuels for the production, harvesting, transport, storage, distribution, and preparation of food supplies around the world. Thus, humanity's primary production systems, its agriculture, have come to function within a global food system that is irretrievably dependent on non-renewables. Becoming dependent on non-renewables effectively guarantees that humanity's food system will in time not be renewed. It's about as simple as it gets. For this reason, humankind cannot survive future trajectories of current agricultural systems because the increasing self-destructive character of this petro-intensive model of agriculture is based upon a futile attempt to work with the simple metaphors of market economics in a vastly more complex global ecosystem. Yes, market economics have a role to play in any agricultural system, but in the final analysis, market economics cannot provide the operative logic for any stable and functioning ecosystem because that system cannot be rigged for the principal benefit of just one of its constituent species. It collapses as a system if it's managed for the primary benefit of one of its constituent species. For this reason, and in short, the Borlaug-Gates petro-intensive agricultural strategies will not work for humankind because they cannot work within a functioning and enduring global agro-ecosystem.